Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show reminding you that Frankie says relax. I'm Christy Powell, and my co-host tonight knows how to live those dreams and scheme those schemes. Welcome, Puck.
Well, hit me with those laser beams. How you doing?
All right, and our guest tonight is here to teach us how to making it our intention. Welcome, Melissa Hargrave.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate it. That's it. I don't know. We can go. What's next?
Oh, sorry. All right. We got to just relax and we're going to get to it. And when you want to call, feel free to call the show at 512-991-9242 or go to tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now.
You know, it's okay, Puck. A little bit of performance anxiety, a little bit of like getting all worked up right before everything is about to pop. It is kind of natural and kind of exactly what we wanted to jump into tonight. We are here to talk a little bit about, I guess, sexual anxiety or anxiety and sex and how they all overlap and get mixed up with each other. I know that sex can be sort of a cause of and something of a solution to anxiety. But Melissa, what does anxiety look like in the context of sex? What are some of like the signs and symptoms of sexual anxiety?
Okay. I'm glad you asked that. Anxiety's main mode of operation is avoidance. So more often than not, we'll see folks avoiding sex. There's also, it can go the opposite direction. It can be a compulsion towards, right? So we want to have it more often because we're anxious, got to have that. It makes us feel better. And then sometimes doesn't. But either way, we're kind of pulsing towards it.
How do we recognize that type of anxiety in ourselves?
Well, and I guess I should also say that, anxiety tends to impact our thinking, our behavior, our how we feel in our body. So oftentimes what we really want to figure out is how people are thinking about their sexual intimacy and how they see themselves, how they see their partners, how they view sexuality in general. It's there's actually a lot that goes into how anxiety can show up.
Yeah, so then it becomes really difficult, I think, to, I guess, differentiate between anxiety and excitement, or honestly, for the purposes of this conversation, what we might call arousal. Is there, a litmus test, or how do we make that distinction?
Yeah, this is you're touching on an interesting question. There's this idea that some people don't feel as much desire, or I hear the word libido, and then some people, they may feel desire but not as much arousal. And we've got there's a lot of things that go into that. For instance, desire is something that we often have to foster and create, and is impacted a lot by dominant narratives in our culture that tell us whether this kind of sexual intimacy is better or worse than that kind of sexual intimacy. Also, well, I think I just lost track because I'm so nervous. But there's just a lot that goes into this. I'll probably say that a million times.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting on the cultural aspect of all of this, which our culture is so much like our vision. I mean, it's in everything that we see, that it's not until we like go to the optometrist and are handed our first pair of glasses or something, or we take them off, or we have like an opportunity to play around with it, that I think we start to recognize that, oh, it doesn't have to look that way, or things are maybe look differently to other people or to other cultures. And the longer we do this show, the more I am convinced that it's not just the case that folks who grew up in church or grew up around certain types of religion have a bad relationship or have been like hurt in their sexuality, the more I become convinced that just the presence of religion, as well as about a gorbillion other factors, have just constructed our relationship with sex entirely. And it makes me really fascinated to wonder about what sex looks like for people 500 years ago, or 5,000 or 50,000 years ago, before the advent of agriculture and civilization and everything else. But our bodies evolved for a certain type of reproduction, and that's very, very different than what we see on MTV or on Pornhub or wherever else nowadays.
Yeah. You know, you gave me two things there. And the one that I think is more important is, instead of thinking about what sex was like, 5,000 years ago, I'm more interested about helping people see that sex is different between every single one of us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have these narratives that say, oh, sex is, two heterosexual people, and it's going to be these polarized genders, male and female, and they're going to get missionary. And sexual intimacy really is so much more. And I hope to, in some ways, get people curious about expanding the erotic canvas from not just our genitals, but to our whole body and our whole lives. And, some of the research says that we can feel desire and arousal for emotional reasons as well as sexual reasons, whether it's someone kissing us or touching our body in such a way that feels sexual, or whether we feel safe and emotionally connected to someone. I could.
I'm glad that you brought up that it's such an individual thing. Because when a lot of when I think of anxiety when it comes to sex, one of the first things that comes to mind is expectations. And depending on what society you're growing up in, this could mean very different things. There are some people who say that our society promotes hypersexualism. If you're growing up in a different culture, it's that you are not supposed to have an interest in sex at all, right? And it makes me, I'm glad to hear you say that it's so much based on the individual, because there are some individuals for whom sex isn't that big a deal, and for another person it might be something like the most important thing that connects them to someone else.
Yeah, yes. And it's worth noting that whether or not it's, quote, a big deal to you doesn't necessarily mean whether or not you're having a good time. So many people spend so much of their lives obsessing about sex without ever really feeling particularly like comfortable or playful or like they're really enjoying themselves.
Yeah, I love the enjoying themselves part. And Puck, you reminded me that I have had so many people come to my office anxious about how often they're masturbating or how often they're having sex. And the thing is that part of that is because they have learned that it's not okay to be a sexual being. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our work, I think, as therapists is really just to normalize people's sexuality.
Yeah. So with all of that in mind, if our entire body is a canvas, if our mind is a canvas, if all of these different pieces are part of our sexuality, it kind of brings the question of how mindfulness factors into our sex lives, because I know a lot of people may be sort of alienated from like their day-to-day anxiety. They may be coming home from work, kind of blocking out the stress of an asshole boss or of a really difficult day. And it's not until they start to become sexual and that they start to really connect with their body and start to recognize like, oh no, there's anxiety here. And I feel like people maybe start to associate that stress response to their arousal or to their sexuality when maybe it's just getting in the way. So many of these things like touch off of one another. And so I'm really curious how mindfulness can help us out here.
Okay. So two of the most important terms are rumination and anxious apprehension. So rumination usually is a symptom of depression where we spend a lot of time thinking about the past. But, anxiety is apprehension about the future. So whether you're in the past or whether you're in the future, you're not in the present. Mindfulness helps us to be in the present, right now, in the moment, rather than in our head or in the future. When we're in our present, we're more in our body. We can tap into what brings us pleasure, to what doesn't bring us pleasure. We can be more in touch with what we want, what we don't want. So being mindful helps us to do that. But it doesn't stop there, because there are like maybe a million levels of mindfulness. And I've never done the authentic relationship stuff that I've seen around town, which I think is really cool as a concept. I have been working with modern analysis for the past 3 or 4 years. And what I love about modern analysis, it is truly the work of becoming more authentic. And when I think of authenticity, I think of really being present. How am I feeling right now? Am I able to put into words rather than action what I'm feeling? Am I able to sit with the discomfort with what I'm feeling and self-soothe? And when we're not in touch with what we're feeling, whether it be sad or disconnected, or there's communication problems in the relationship, or we don't feel good about ourselves or our partner, then when we're not talking about that and we're not given permission to talk about sexuality in general, then anxiety is really great about taking over and saying, we'll just avoid all that. We just won't. Yeah.
Well, if anxiety is in a lot of ways like obsessing over the past or worrying about the future, what are some of the more common causes of sexual anxiety?
Numerous. Performance anxiety is one of the top ones that I think about.
Sure.
So we're having sexual intimacy and we're worried about whether the techniques we're using are working for a partner. We're worried about whether we are pleasing our partner, whether we look good, whether they still like us after this. If I tell them what I like and what I want, will they still accept me? So there's a lot of fear about negative evaluation from our partners. This looks a lot and could be related very much to social anxiety, which also has a fear of negative judgment from others. Now, that doesn't mean that performance anxiety is social anxiety. It just means that when we're looking at people who are struggling with these internal thoughts or negative thoughts about their performance, that it might be something to consider. Other ways that anxiety impacts sex, there are things like medical conditions that can make us feel anxious. Having cancer can really impact how our body feels, how we feel in our minds, can impact our lubrication, our erections. And so it's kind of, you have to do a mental shift around being sexually intimate at those times. And so that can create anxiety, just having to transition where you are and to manage the grief and the struggle that you're having with the cancer. Another way that I see anxiety come through is, and this is really what got me into doing this research on sexual anxiety, is that I was working with a couple that had very normal desire discrepancy. And that's where one of the partners wants intimacy seemingly more than the other. And I work with these couples all the time. It's a really easy thing to work through. You know, we just try to get everybody on the same page on what they want intimacy to look like. And then we have them start with some non-demand work towards getting back to a place where they feel really sexy together. And I was working with this couple, and they were both gung-ho, really willing to do the work. And the minute they got into a sacred place for sexuality, just abject fear would come up. Mm-hmm. And that fear was much like a phobia. And, you know, phobias are sometimes really well treated by exposure response therapy. And at the time, I referred this client to a CBT therapist, and I didn't check to see if that therapist was sex positive. I I don't know a lot of CBT therapists who are willing or able to do a sex positive hierarchical fear chart that will help someone desensitize to their anxiety. Another example that I thought was really neat, and I heard this example from a psychiatrist conference, was it's related to OCD. This person had a fear that they would sometimes pre-ejaculate in their underwear, and I guess I should have asked what we can talk about beforehand.
Oh yeah, no, fucking bring it on. We're here for it. This is YouTube.
All right, excellent. So they had to pre-ejaculate in their underwear, and needed to and would go to the local laundry mat to do their laundry, and they had fear that some woman would get pregnant because of that underwear being washed at the laundromat. And so, to desensitize to this fear, really, this person had to go and do their laundry at every laundromat in town. And that way you never really know if every pregnant woman you see, if they're carrying your baby. So,
I mean, it's a possibility, right?
yeah. And it's interesting how anxiety can show up. There's a million examples. So
this is good. This is the Puck sits back and learns episode, because when I think of sexual anxiety, I think of only in very narrow terms, and this is good that it's opening up. Like for me, sexual anxiety, before this conversation, boils down to expectations and standards and normalization, where you brought this up a little bit earlier too, about how some people are worried maybe that they masturbate too much or not enough or don't have enough interest, and how it might be perfectly fine for that person or the couple who has you said different levels of interest, and some of the so to me, the easing of the sexual anxiety is about realizing how okay this is, and how normalized everything is and could be. So what would you say is the intersection between expectations and standards and normalization and anxiety?
let me make sure I understand you correctly. Expectations, well, we'd want to explore them, right? Whose expectations? Are there our parents, our pastors, or the pastors of everybody else, right? Like, we have some
Or the Calvin Klein ad, or a million things.
Thank you. And we don't know where some of these expectations come from, but we want to explore them. And then oftentimes it's normalizing our sexual attitudes and behaviors, and busting some of the ones that don't work for us. So if you want to masturbate 8 times a day or none, you have the right. You have that right. And honoring each individual's right to enjoy their intimacy in the way that they want is a really important thing often. So that alone can reduce anxiety when people hear that it's okay to be doing what they're doing, and that everybody has sex differently, and you're allowed to have sex the way you want to have sex, as long as it's consensual, right?
Yeah, nobody's keeping score. There is nobody in heaven with a magic book or a good place points system that is tracking the number of ejaculations you have or whatever else. But you talked about performance anxiety as well as medical conditions that cause anxiety and all of those things. So it makes me wonder: is it more accurate to say that sex causes anxiety, or that anxiety interferes with our sex?
It's both. It's both. And sometimes, like for instance, sexual trauma can come out in our sexual intimacy mentally as well as physical reactions. So which do you manage first? Do you want to work on the sexual intimacy first or the trauma first that may be impacting the intimacy? So really the idea is to understand that anxiety can come from a multitude of places, and it's, we try to take a biopsychosocial approach. Let's look at all the things. If you look at studies for vaginal and vulvar pain, you will find that vulvodynia has, let me make sure I'm not getting this backwards, has a high connection to anxiety and fear. So a lot of what we do to work with people with vaginas is to help them to manage the sensations in their body and the thinking that's going on so that they can be in a more relaxed place. Yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question correctly, though.
I mean, just the simple reality is that it is both. You know that that sex and anxiety are often playing off of each other and getting off. You know, when we talk about anxiety, we are talking about such a big word that maybe it would be useful in the future for us to kind of narrow it down and to do this episode a little bit more specifically. But the truth is, I know the folks that come into my therapy office, and I have to imagine yours as well, are often just saying, I like sex, but I hate it. And it makes me nervous and I don't know why. And I don't know what's happening. And, you know, and that's often how anxiety exists for us. It's not as this like very clinical, well, you know, because of this experience when I was a child, I very clear. It so rarely presents like that. It's more just this like nebulous cloud of terrible discomfort. And I think that that's worth noting. But you know, we've got a call on the line, and I'm going to let Puck get that pulled up for us. But before you jump in there, Puck, I guess I wanted to just very quickly hit on something that you and I talked about before the show, Melissa, about how, you know, you mentioned like a CBT therapist that wasn't necessarily sex positive. And the reality is that a lot of sex therapists are not specializing in anxiety or anxiety disorders. And seemingly very few therapists don't have any real or meaningful training in sexuality. And so I guess I'm just really curious what the solution to that problem looks like. I mean, it makes sense to me that people are really uncomfortable talking to their doctors, to their counselors, to their whoever's about sex.
Well, you know, education.
Sure.
But when folks come my way, I ask them to see a doctor. When folks go to doctors, some of those doctors tell them to come see me. And I need more doctors to get sex education as well. And I don't think there's enough sex education for doctors. So usually what I end up doing is schlepping my way to each doctor in the area and, you know, saying, excuse me, did you know I can help with this? And I think if there are more of us doing it and there are more presentations and workshops for people in the medical field, then we would have more reciprocity to help people with the mental and physical part of managing anxiety. And I want to talk about before, at some point, PTSD and anxiety and the stress response. Just to bookmark that.
Yeah, for sure. We'll do it.